Welcome to the podcast. I'm Coach Tyler here with the lovely Dr. Lisa. How are you, Lisa?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm doing great. You say really well, but I can see the energy about to explode out of your body because Dr. Lisa's a fangirl. Maybe I'll let you do this one, slide us in. What do you think? Yeah?
Okay.
Why don't you take it away on this one
I will
because
take it
I can tell how
away.
excited you are.
We are so excited to welcome our guest. She is an author, speaker. She does all the things, and she's going to tell us more about, her story. But welcome, Harriet Brown, to the podcast. Thanks for agreeing to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. You
Absolutely.
know, you're different guests than we normally have. We have people who typically have, these big social media followings and podcasts and whatnot, but you're an educator, you're an author, you're someone who doesn't necessarily seem like they want to go out in the world and jump on podcasts and have the best social media and whatnot. But I'm excited today because we're going to unpack an important topic, right? I think so many of us end up in the place we're in and we start talking about at WeShape, how the fitness industry and diet culture has led us to kind of all, in a nutshell, not like ourselves, right? But the science and the history behind this is something that you cover in great detail. So maybe we start with your story. Like, how did you get to the point where that was the topic you wanted to investigate? And then maybe also just unpack, like, what can people hope to learn on this episode as well?
All great questions. I'm a journalist by training, and I never set out to write about weight. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. Like so many women in my generation, weight was a huge thing. I was always on a diet. I think the first official diet I ever went on, I was 14 with my mother. We went on a diet together. It was a constant topic of conversation in my family among all the women. And it was just something that was a given. And the given was, you had to be thin, basically.
Yeah.
And you had to do anything you could to get thin. And that's something I struggled with. And, so fast forward through my adolescence, through my early adulthood, and through my daughter's early years. And then when my oldest daughter turned 14, she developed a really severe case of anorexia and almost died. And suddenly I was seeing this whole conversation that I'd had my entire life, this sort of obsession in my head and things I talked about with friends and weight. Suddenly it was like flipped on its side, and I was coming at it from a different perspective. So
Yep.
instead of thinking constantly about how to lose weight, how to eat less, suddenly it was like, how can we get more calories into her? How can we get her to gain weight? And it was just such a startling process. It actually made me aware of how dysfunctional my own thought process and relationship with weight and food and all of this had been for such a long time. And also, it gave me an opportunity to see it from a different perspective. So, like, when I would be the focus of, some kind of discrimination, or when people would make remarks or whatever, I had so deeply internalized those norms that, you can't be like a valuable person unless you're thin, that I felt like I deserved whatever came my way. But with my daughter, I saw such a strange dynamic, when she was at her thinnest, gaunt, dying, really. She was close to dying. Women would literally come up to her on the street, strangers, and say, "You are so beautiful. You could model. Have you ever thought of modeling? Blah, blah, blah." All
Mm.
this stuff. And I would just want to punch them. And then conversely, as she began to recover, as she gained weight, as she looked much better, all of that stopped. All of it went away.
Yep.
And it suddenly showed it to me. We often see things through our kids' experience in a very different way than through our own. And it kind of showed me how messed up it all was. So that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole of, well, what do we actually know about this relationship between weight and health? Is it what I have been taught? Is it, fat is bad, thin is good, period, end of conversation? And that's what inspired me to write the book Body of Truth. And, TLDR, no, it's not what we've been taught. But we're going to unpack that, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, we
Thank
are.
you for sharing that, by the way. I have two daughters myself, and part of my own kind of movement away from probably more of like an orthorexic perspective. It was, doing the blood panels and the tests and the this and the that, and then watching my daughter slowly develop, like sneaking different foods and like doing things like that. I was like, wait a second, we are planting the seeds of an eating disorder right now, thinking that we're healthy, right? And it was at
Right.
the moment that we let that go that like everybody's relationship with food changed, including my own. It was like, eat the damn peanut butter cup and enjoy it, and then just go on with your day, right? And then let your
Right.
kids witness someone who can just eat a peanut butter cup and enjoy it and go on with their day and not have to eat the whole bag or eat nothing, right?
Right.
So again, I just appreciate you sharing that, because I so feel that when you have children and you watch them suffer, it really makes you question, why.
Everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a similar experience with I have daughters, they're 13 and 11, and my son is 9. And when my 13-year-old was about 5 or 6, I was a very serious dieter, and our
Mm.
pantry was very bare, and it had, whole grain this and oat that, and no, no potato chips, no sugar, no candy. And my
Mm.
daughter, I think she was actually 8, because she was going to school and she was essentially stealing snacks from her classmates.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and she's a super sweet kid who would never steal, but that was worth it to her. And I remember having to sort of look in the mirror, and I didn't even walk away from like, restriction at that moment, but it at least made me open up my mind to the idea that like, oh, she needs access to these things that I'm restricting from her, or this is going to be a problem. But I, just like Tyler, was very like orthorexic in like my obsession with movement and my obsession with the way clean eating and dieting and whatnot. And I saw it was going to impact my children very negatively. And so, yeah, I think you're right. We see things very differently when we look through the lens of our children. But it's so hard because this stuff is normalized. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is like, why is this stuff so normalized? You watched your daughter struggle with a very serious eating disorder and get praise from people who said she looked beautiful in that size.
Mhm.
The All of the habits that are encouraged in mainstream fitness and diet culture are the things we don't want people who have any history of eating disorders to do. But doesn't that seem stupid? That like,
Yes.
because what is, it literally leads to the same thing. So I want you to start telling the listeners like, why it's so normalized,
Why are
how
we
it
here?
became like, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Because there's a real reason. It did just no one just dropped it. It became a thing, and there's some historical data around it. So I would love for you to start there for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. But before I do, I just want to, I'm sure you've heard this, but the psychologist Deb Burgard, who's a wonderful therapist out on the West Coast, she says, I'm not going to get the words exactly right, but something like the behaviors that we, try to eradicate in people with eating disorders are the ones that we encourage in fat people, basically.
Basically,
And they're exactly the same behaviors, diet, exercise, restricting, counting calories, all of that stuff.
100%.
And it's complex where it comes from. In some ways, it's complex, and in some ways, it's really not. Sabrina Strings wrote a phenomenal book called Fearing
Fearing
the
the
Black
Black Body,
Body.
another great one.
Yeah, a great book where she kind of looked at the history of how, misogyny, Christianity, and misogyny, Christianity, and racism all came together to sort of create this, what at the time, and we're talking about like the 18th century, was this new American ideal of, what is beauty and what is like the standard for, women's bodies. And of course, it was much more than a standard for bodies. It was a standard for behavior. It was a standard for docility. Women were supposed to be slender and dainty and frail and require protecting and Christian and temperate and white. And, so much of it really grows out of social identity, right? Like our, differentiating ourselves from other people to prove our superiority. That's basically what it comes down to. When I teach this kind of stuff to my students at Syracuse University, and I often use the Dr. Seuss book, the Sneetches. Do you know that book? The Star-Bellied Sneetches. So it's a great book, and it's just right on point for this stuff. It's about these imaginary creatures called Sneetches, and they have stars. Some of them have stars on their bellies, and some don't. And the ones who have stars just think they're better than the ones who don't. And so they create this sort of two-tier social system, and then somebody comes through town with a machine that will put a star on your belly. It's amazing. And so suddenly they all have stars on their bellies. And wow, this is not okay. So the ones who started with stars now find a way to get the stars off their bellies. And they just go around and around in this circle until, because it's Dr. Seuss, nobody can remember who had one and who didn't, and they all live happily ever after, right? But it's such an encapsulation of how we are as humans. Like we want to identify with our groups, and then we want to feel better than them. And that is a big part, I think, of what has perpetuated weight stigma in this country, that it is a way for, and especially with all the associations between, socioeconomic status and weight, in our culture today, to be thin, very often means that you have access to, a certain kind of food and a certain kind of opportunity for movement and a certain kinds of support and whatever that most people don't have. So it's all of these things come together, and then, you add in the medical profession and how thinness has become fetishized, I would say, in among doctors. And wow, you get a very potent mix that is very much with us still.
Yeah.
Wow. I have a question about this, like, desire to be superior, right? I think this is something that's so pervasive, is that human beings, we just want to be better than, we want to be perceived as better than. And I'm curious, what research, if any, you've done on that particular topic about why this exists, because sometimes I can extrapolate in my head, maybe this is just the primal, side of our brain that's telling us, we have to get the big piece of chicken and save ourselves and, that kind of thing, right? And yeah. I also think that society has contributed to it as well. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
You're not far off. I mean, I think it's because humans are social creatures. So it has been important to our survival to always know, where do we stand in the pack? Where are we in the hierarchy? And also to understand, like, I think it's a normal cognitive process, this sort of social categorization that we do, right? Where we look at people and immediately make a judgment about whether they are like us or different from us. Are they dangerous to us or are they allies? These are decisions that obviously for thousands of years we've had to be able to make in a heartbeat. Yeah. And I think that that's still very much at play. I don't think we can change that. But I think what has happened is that we've like sort of taken that germ of whatever cognitive, issue that is, and we've like created this whole culture around it, and we've sort of like set it in resin, and sort of preserved it that way. And so it's sort of like a bad coping habit that you develop early in your life, and later you realize it's not really serving me anymore, but I still am stuck with it, and I'm going to have to work really hard to unstick. And I kind of think that's where we're at with it.
Yeah, it feels so true. Like, it feels like, at least in my own experience, and I know it's different from so many people's, but like, I feel like I wanted to be successful and fit, and like me wanting to do that is propagating the other people being perceived as that, and then me going that direction is propagating that narrative, and more and more and more, until the point where you realize, like, this is not the path towards happiness. The path towards happiness is self-acceptance and offering that acceptance and kindness to others. And so how do we as a society, right? You said we set this in resin. What a poignant statement. How do we as a society crack open that resin and start saying, hey, this isn't working?
Oh, that's a really good question. And honestly, if I had the answer to that, I could, probably be fabulously wealthy or win a Pulitzer or something. But I'll just tell you what I think, which is it seems to me that we can understanding is always a good first step, and hearing from people with different lived experiences and sort of cognitively understanding, which is why I wrote Body of Truth, because it was like, let's unpack what the actual situation is. But what I've learned is that doesn't change anybody's mind, or changes very few people's minds. The only
Right.
thing that seems to change our minds about these like deeply held beliefs is some kind of emotional experience. So like what I went through with my daughter, seeing the pain and the suffering caused by these deeply entrenched ideas and sort of, directives around weight, seeing what it did to her. It could do that to me. I'd been living with that my whole life.
Right.
That's okay, but like watching it do it to her was an emotional experience that traumatized me,
Yeah.
and it changed me. It changed the way I thought. So, I don't know, how do you apply that to a whole culture, right? But I do think it takes something like that, because again, I teach this stuff, and my students, they are eager to hear it. They want to hear it. I don't know that I change how they feel about any of it. I like to think that it plants a little seed, and that
Right.
maybe five
Yeah.
years later they're gonna have some experience that's gonna resonate with that. But
Yeah.
I don't really know.
I think that is what it is. It's planting the seeds. It's, when I came to this work, and like I said, your book was one of the first books. I think it was after I read Dr. Bacon's Health at Every Size. I think your book
Hmm.
was the next book I picked up. And I think I was eager to learn more. Like I got it and I was like, whoa. But I think the point with that is I had some very personal experiences around weight and my body and dealing with my children. And so I was very eager. So I just went down the rabbit hole. I just kept getting more books and listening to more podcasts.
Hmm.
And then I implemented it into my life. But I know that's not how it happens for a lot of us, especially people who are stumbling upon this work or that might stumble upon this podcast. It's like the difference between the knowing and the feeling, right? Like you said,
Hmm.
like, okay, I know it. There's a history to this. It makes sense. But like, I'm not ready to abandon my
Hmm.
body goals. I'm not ready to abandon my diet. I'm not ready to abandon this idea that success to me looks like living in a thin body, having a
Hmm.
great job, having lots of money, looking very beautiful, and like detaching ourselves from that desire, that vision board that I think a lot of us made is really, really tough. But the seeds matter. The seeds that we plant matter because later on we come back to these things. I think when we have these difficult experiences, these challenging experiences, and or someone else brings it up, or it's like, oh, or we watch someone else suffer. So I think it's really important. So I just the fact that you're teaching at a university is just to me is amazing because I think impacting the minds of these young people at that juncture is
Hmm.
like we didn't get that then. Like I didn't get this till I was almost 40. So I think
Right.
it's a very cool thing to do. And then even having these conversations with my children now, it's like I didn't hear this stuff when I was their age. So yeah, I might not that doesn't mean my oldest has still had body image struggles. She's
Right.
still been like, "Oh, my stomach." And I caught her, I've never told anybody this, but I caught her trying to sleep in a waist trainer, like she had borrowed from someone.
Oh.
And I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I was so like, it was like a blow to my chest. Like,
Yeah.
my baby would do this. Like, but she lives in this world and I can't completely shield her from it. Now, I quickly took it and threw it away, but, but that doesn't mean she won't have another desire
Right.
to restrict her body, to change herself in some way. So it's really hard, but I think the seeds really, really matter. And so, again, grateful that you're doing this work and that you're actively teaching young people. I enjoy when I get to talk to like pre-physical therapy or pre-medical students about the weight stigma, medical weight stigma side
Hmm.
of it. And a lot of
Hmm.
them I can see when they're in the room, they're like, but
Yeah.
it's a planting a seed. Like maybe we'll get one or two doctors out of here that are aligned and safe, for the
Yeah.
clients I see to see
Yeah.
them. So
Yeah.
thank you again for
Yeah.
your work.
And I think you're not planting like little bushes, right? And little flowers or perennial, these things don't grow fast, right? You're planting like a grove of giant sequoias. And so you never know if some of the things that you're talking about are going to have a ripple effect decades or maybe even a century down the road. Because I think that the more we bring this to the awareness of this society that's stuck in resin, the more cracks we create in that belief system. And I think that's so important because to me, I think the reason, this is just my own opinion, but I think the reason why so many of us want to elevate ourselves and, judge ourselves above other people is this deep underlying sense of I'm not whole.
Yeah.
I'm not worthy of love. And we're just seeking like love and validation.
Right.
And, as time goes on and I see more people awaken to that message and recognize that we're just stuck in self-judgment and self-shame, the more people start to work on cultivating that. And as we cultivate that inside of ourselves, we are able to offer that outside of ourselves, and we give more people permission to do the same.
Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier. You said, when you were doing this writing and what you were doing with this book was just kind of presenting, here's what it is. And I'm wondering if you can tell us from your perspective, like, what is it? Like, why, again, going back to that, why are we here? Why are we in this? I know you talked about a little bit, a couple hundred years ago and creating this idealized image and elevation above everybody else and we're better than. But like, as it stands right now, what are we all stuck in?
Well, we're stuck in a perspective that has become so deeply embedded in the medical profession. That is a huge part of the problem. And so, probably like everybody else, I sort of started with the assumption that, fatness is bad, thinness is good, and that there was like a linear relationship between the two. In other words, the fatter you were, the farther away you were from that sort of thin ideal, the less and less healthy you were. And I went to the research to see if that was borne out. And you have to understand about the research on weight and health that it's largely done by people who have a vested interest in the whole diet culture. So it's done by, and that will alter the results. So it's done by people who are, like bariatric surgery people or, big pharmaceutical companies that make these medications that supposedly make people thinner or, whatever, people who have vested interest in it. But even understanding that, you don't see that linear relationship in the research. What you see is you see a mixture of things, really. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of an epidemiologist named Catherine Flegel. She's retired now, but she was an epidemiologist with the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, for many years. She is a very, practical, hard-headed, not a sort of advocate in any way, let's say. And she also got curious about this relationship, specifically the relationship between like mortality, so dying early, and weight, because that also has been presented as this linear relationship. The fatter you are, the more likely you are. Some scientist at some point literally did a back of the envelope calculation at one point and came up with a ridiculous figure, like, being this fat will take this many years off your life, which, tip, there's no such thing. But anyway, so she decided to look at all of the research, like do a meta-analysis, look at many, many, many studies and see. And one of the things that makes it challenging to study this is that there's a lot of what we call confounding variables. So for instance, if you smoke, that we know that A tends to suppress your weight, and B is associated with many, many negative health consequences. And so when people look at this relationship, they're not really sure, should we exclude smokers from this? Should we include them? So Catherine Flegel was like, I'm just going to gather everything and look at it all together because the scale is going to be so big that whatever emerges will be valid. And she's done this, she did it like, I think 4 times she went through this process. And every single time she found, instead of the linear relationship she expected, she found like a J-shaped curve. Yeah. And which means that your risk of dying early was highest at the two extreme ends of the curve. So if you were very underweight, or I think it was BMI 40 and above, she found there were associations, not cause and effect. You can't show cause and effect. Associations with dying early, which could be explored then and understood. The bottom of the curve, so your lowest chance of dying early, was in what we call the overweight to mildly obese part of the BMI chart. So like BMI 25 to like 32, 33, something like that.
Right.
And
The bottom of the curve. I just
the
want to
bottom,
clarify that.
your
The bottom
lower,
of the curve. The lowest likelihood of this affecting your
right,
mortality.
exactly. So she just, in her matter-of-fact way, just published these findings. And wow, did that stir up? I don't know what words I'm allowed to say on here, but it was
All of them.
Anyone you want.
Yeah, go
it
for it.
was a shitstorm. Let's just say that. A total shitstorm of people saying, you don't know what you're talking about, you've done this wrong, your methodology is incorrect. In fact, a guy at Harvard named Walter Willett, who's a well-known, champion of diet culture and whatever, he organized a whole conference at Harvard, a 2-day conference, specifically about let's discredit Catherine Flegel.
Wow.
Kind of funny, actually, but not funny. So,
You're onto something when you got a whole team of people trying to discredit.
Credits.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So, but she got so much hatred, and I can say, just as a journalist, at times when there was a period of time about 10 years ago when I published a number of stories in the New York Times and they were reported stories. They weren't like me giving my opinion about anything. They were reporting on this kind of research, reporting on things like the so-called obesity paradox and whatever, simply reporting the fact that this relationship is not what we all think it is. And I can't even tell you the amount of hate mail I got. Hate mail, vile emails, like saying, "Fatty, you should just go home and die. You're disgusting." Like abuse, hatred, simply for reporting facts. So I can only imagine what Catherine Flegel received. And that was really interesting to me because it's like, okay, not just the question that we started with here, which is why do we think these things, but why do we think these things with so much rage?
That's the thing,
And
rage.
like, why are we so attached to it that it provokes this level of hatred in people? That was fascinating to me. And I don't have like a clear black and white answer, but what I think, and I would love to hear what you think too, is, when you've invested so much of your life in this paradigm, and when you've done all the right things, and you've suffered, we've all, like, a lot of us have done it, right? You exercise even when you don't feel like it. You starve yourself even when you really want that peanut butter cup, whatever it is, whatever the behaviors are that you've done, and you've deprived yourself. You want to be rewarded for that. Yeah. And the idea that maybe that wasn't necessary after all, like maybe you're not actually any healthier when you do that. Maybe you over there on the couch, you're eating all the peanut butter cups and you're not like out there running 10 miles a day. Wait, you're actually going to live longer than I am? No, that's not fair. So I think to some extent it's an exercise in privilege, and the sort of zero-sum game of like, wait, if you get that privilege, then that means I don't have it, and that's not okay with me. So, very interesting.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I think it has a lot to do with also investing. You said investing all of your energy in that, but you also invest like your identity in that. And I know for me, when I had to like break down the walls of diet culture, it was scary because it almost felt like I didn't know who I was anymore. Because I was known as a girl. Where is my value? Where is my purpose and passion? How am I going to be taken seriously? What are people going to think about me? This is something that I believed deeply. And I was known as the fitness instructor and the girl who would be like, put down that candy bar and eat a salad. And, so it was so much a part of who I was. The thought of all of that being wrong, it made me feel stupid. It made me feel naive. It made me feel, like I didn't know what my worth and value was anymore, because I invested my identity into those things, into diet culture. I mean, my dad was a fitness competitor. So I've been around
Yeah.
bodies, aesthetics and fitness my whole life. And I was a runner and a dancer. And I just believed that we had all this power and control over what our bodies looked like, how healthy we were, and what we were going to be able to do in our lives. And to be confronted with like, oh, my dear, you don't have that power. You don't have that control. It was like somebody took everything from me. So now I didn't treat people rudely like, some of the mail that you get and the things that people say online. But I remember just feeling sad. Like something was stripped away from me that I valued so much. And I had to figure out how to rebuild the pieces and figure out who I was outside of that. So that's a part of what I think it is for people who get so angry when you say the thing. And I get it too on my social platforms. They're like, they're like, oh, shut up. Even on our WeShape platform. And I ignore it most of the time, but occasionally I go in there just to give you a little, sometimes I have time is what I say. And, I might be talking about back pain and someone will be like, well, I'm sure, you being fat is more of an issue than you have. And I'm like,
Right.
okay, because then people don't have back pain. You're so right. I'm like, God, thank you.
Why didn't I mention that?
Damn it. So, sometimes I say something to just let them know, like, I see you and I know why you're talking the way you're talking, but you're wrong. And guess what? It's okay to be wrong, because we are all going to be wrong. And I remember being wrong. I remember thinking those mean thoughts. I didn't say the shit because I'm not that rude, but I remember thinking those mean thoughts about others. But it's not right. And so I think that's what it is. People get very invested in that, and that becomes their identity. And it's really hard to be like, damn, I was wrong.
And we want to feel like we have control over them.
Yeah.
And that's healthism, right? Like you want to believe that if you do everything right, like it all works out for you. And like guess what, folks? That's not how it works.
That is not how it works.
Like my grandfather, ate whatever he wanted and smoked a cigar every day of his adult life and lived to be 98.
Same. I have a granddad. He outlived my parents. He outlived my other grandparents, and he drank whiskey and smoked weed every single day, and he died at 97.
Right.
That's wild.
That's just genetics, folks. That's just the luck of the draw. We don't get to choose that stuff, And that's hard, because ultimately I think it's also like about our status as mortal beings. Like we want to believe that we can change somehow, we can, but like you have to give it up, because we really
Go.
That fear of it, that impermanence again, I think that really strikes that up. And to me, there's like this, you say this too, Lisa, this moral undertone of this too, right? Like, I am right, and this is the righteous path, and this is what everyone should do. And that's, to me, like if you don't feel like it's a part of your value system and your morals and your identity, then you're not going to get so upset about it, right? But that's where we need to get people to like accept themselves more. Yeah. Because if someone can't accept you, ultimately, what's that telling us? Their internal dialogue is really not kind. It's not accepting themselves. They're probably still looking in the mirror and thinking critically and negative about themselves, whereas someone else can just absolutely love who they are, right? And then just hate all day long on that. Right. So I think that, I hope that over time people can notice that, and that moral character will just go away. You don't have to be holier than thou because you're on a diet and somebody else isn't. But I wanted to speak to something else that you said about this J curve, because I find this so fascinating because, when it comes to health, what do we talk about? Diet and exercise.
And that's it.
Right? Diet and exercise. That's the only thing we talk about. Diet and exercise. Well, if you diet and exercise, then all this stuff's, you're going to have control, and you're going to be able to regulate how long your lifespan is. And, one of the hardest things in life is to see people around you that are healthy, that make good choices, that are fit, that take care of themselves, and they get cancer, and they get heart disease, and other things happen. And it's a really challenging thing to experience. So, for the people out there who are those haters, like, what do you show them? How do you show them that data, that whatever it may be, that says like, this is not the diet and exercise is not the only thing. How much you like yourself is important. Your relationships are important. You know, where you live and whether there's an toxic environment around you is important.
How much sleep you get.
How much sleep you get, access to healthcare, whether, you know, you live in a place that's dangerous or not, right? There's so much that goes into this.
Social determinants of health. That is exactly right. Well, I'll tell you a little story that illustrates to me how frustrating this process can be. So I once, for one of these pieces for the New York Times, I was interviewing a cardiologist who shall remain nameless. And I was interviewing him because I was doing a story on the so-called obesity paradox, which is just the idea. And the name itself is sort of, represents all of this thinking. It's like the idea that some people with certain kinds of chronic diseases, we're talking about like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, so specifically diseases that are often associated with fatness.
Yeah.
But sometimes people with those chronic diseases actually do better, are less sick, and live longer if they're fatter than people who say, oh, you know, you're diagnosed with heart disease and you immediately are told to drop weight, and you do, and, you know, they sometimes have worse outcomes. So this has been labeled the obesity paradox. It's now been studied in many, many, many organ systems, but there's been a lot of looking at it in cardiac terms because it's quite robust in certain heart conditions, right? And this guy had done research on it, and so I was interviewing him, and he had done all these studies, and they, time after time pointed to this finding, and we had this whole interview, and then at the end, he said to me, but I still always tell people, my patients to lose weight if they're diagnosed with these things. And I said, why?
He said, fuck the research.
Talking about this, why? And he literally said to me, because everyone knows it's better to be thin.
And I love those unquestioned assumptions that we just buy into.
Oh,
Yeah,
it was like one of those Kafkaesque moments where you're like, I'm trapped in an Escher painting. I can't get out of this. I don't, like, what can you say? It's completely irrational. And that's, goes back to my earlier point. Like, reason doesn't talk people out of these deeply held, as you pointed out, like these beliefs that are crucial to your sense of identity and self. Something else has to sort of move that needle for you. And I think, that's what's hard. It's going to be something different for every person. It often involves suffering, which is really unfortunate. But those hegemonic norms are so powerful. And then they get reinforced all the time. I mean, I've had so many fat phobic experiences with doctors, so many at this point, that it's just, and you know what, even with everything I know and looking at the research and everything I understand, I still go home and cry after those. They are still so,
It hurts.
Yeah, it still hurts.
Yeah.
I
think our culture too of just like headlines and short form content is also like really propagating this mess because it just feels like everyone out there is just sharing their truth, I'm air quoting, their truth of what they learned off of TikTok in 90 seconds or less, right? And the platform's validating everything that they're watching because it's created for confirmation biases, right?
Absolutely. Right.
And so like it's so hard when so much of society is helping us propagate our belief systems up,
right?
And it's just like, how do we spread this message more so that people can get rid of those thoughts? I just can't believe that someone would do the research and then just be like, but we all know. I hate that phrase, but everyone knows, right?
Everybody knows.
This is like when your parents say something to you and then you say, because I said so, right?
I said so.
It's like, if I find myself saying because I said so, I know I'm doing something wrong,
Exactly. If I had $1 for every time, and it's usually a man, no disrespect to the men in this room.
That's okay.
But every
It
time
sometimes.
a man on social media, I will talk about my experience or I will mention some research and they're like, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, that's bad. And I go to their page and it's like private, but they're like a freaking carpenter or something. And it's like, you don't even live in this work. Like you don't even look at the research. You don't even work with the people, but I'm wrong and you're right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, sir. It's a lot of mansplaining and a lot of just just trying to discredit, your thoughts and the work that you're deeply invested in. So, yeah, it's frustrating. And then experiences in the doctor's office is a really important. The fat phobia that our medical system is like okay with, the anti-fat bias, it is just insane. And one of my favorite sort of resources, they're not in the US, but Dr. Asher Larmy, the fat doctor, really excellent content as a practicing or previously practicing physician, to just be very honest about what the research says. And he will say very clearly, like, suggesting weight loss for our clients with like diabetes and other stuff, it's actually harming them.
Yeah.
I mean, just very, very outright. It is actually dangerous to say, go lose weight because you have diabetes or because you have heart disease. And I just like that no nonsense approach, because we need to see it, and we need to see it for what it is, instead of all the sugarcoating and the clear results on the research, but like, but still, there's no harm in weight loss. There's real harm in trying to lose weight. And I want our listeners to know, if you take nothing else away from this, there's harm in intentional weight loss. And I don't knock anybody who does it, because I understand why anyone wants to be thin living in this world. It makes sense. You heard it from your doctor. You believe it in your heart. But there is harm that can be done in intentionally trying to lose weight, period. And just be aware of that, and learn a little bit more about that before you take the weight loss, drug, before you go on the next diet. Just educate yourself, because it's a fact that there's harm that can be done. So.
Right. And now that we are in this era of these GLP-1 receptor drugs, I just heard a story yesterday from a colleague who told me her husband went to the doctor for something. He's not thin, but he's not like, I wouldn't like describe him as fat. He's somewhere in the middle, like a lot of people. And that he wasn't going for anything that could remotely be connected with weight. But the doctor said to him, hey, have you ever thought about Ozempic? Like, just brought it up out of the blue. And it was like, it was raised with this sense of like, well, why wouldn't you do this?
Yeah.
That weight loss surgery, that's really hard. That's brutal. But this is like, you just take this shot every week, whatever. Like, what's the big deal? Hey, give it a try. And again, it wasn't like he went saying, oh, I'd really like to lose weight, I can't do it, whatever. But and that's, so I think that bias is getting stronger now.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Now it's perceived as just easy. Why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, and behind the scenes of that, there's some darkness. With WeShape, we focus primarily on helping people like love and appreciate themselves and show up for their workouts as an act of self-care, because they want to care for their bodies. They want to practice movement. They want to develop their capacity to move freely for as long as possible. They want to feel good, right? And I get solicited about 10 times a week from these GLP-1 distributors to see if we want to add this into WeShape. And I just ignore this stuff until I actually called a colleague of mine who's in like he does like heat patches for people who are elderly, right? And he's like, have you considered doing this? Because I think it's going to be adding so much and blah, blah. And I was like, oh my God, behind those recommendations is people with money bags in their eyes.
Yeah.
Just going, money bags, money bags, money bags. Let me get you hooked on this thing for life.
Yep.
For life, right? And all because we think it's the better thing to do for your health, right?
I don't even know if they think it's the better thing to do for your health. I think that is reaching. I think they just believe, I think the money bags is where it ends for a lot of people. And they just believe that people look better and are better when they're thinner.
Yes.
And I don't think they care necessarily what's
I was
happening in your
just
health.
going to say something about that. That's exactly what I think. This whole conversation is constantly couched around health, but I don't actually think it has much to do with health.
Right.
I'm not saying doctors don't care about your health, right? Many doctors do care about your health, so I don't want to be like anti-doctor, but I will say that this cultural thing is really, when it comes down to it, it's about exactly what you just said. We think you look better and you are better when you're not fat.
Are better. That's so. Woo. That's dark. That's dark. I don't know if we can end the podcast on that type of darkness right now. Lisa, bring us around somehow.
I really think that's the truth, and I think it's important to end right there, if I'm being honest. So
Right.
This has been so good. I
I
love
know.
talking to you.
It's
Can
been
we talk
great.
again later?
I would love to. I would love to connect with you more. Yeah, that would be
Okay.
great.
Perfect, perfect. Well, I would love for our listeners to know how they can connect with you, your work, what you're doing, any offerings you have. Um,
Sure. You can learn more about me and my work at my website, which is harrietbrown.com. I'm always happy to hear from people. There's my emails on the site there. I love connecting with people and hearing like what you're going through, what you're thinking, because I do think there's great value in community around these issues, and I know that it helps me tremendously to hear from people and talk to other people who are also wrestling with some of these same things.
Yay.
Well, Harriet, thank you so much for taking the time today to share your story with us, to share your wisdom with our listeners. I know that was a beautiful conversation, and I'm really grateful we had it.
I really enjoyed it. So thanks, guys, and thanks for what you do.
Thank you.